Hello, I'm going to be reading today from the Humble Little Condom, chapters 9 and 10. Okay. 9. Obscenity laws, American tips, and French ticklers. Just make sure this is plugged in. It's not. One moment. Okay. Obscenity laws, American tips, and French ticklers. Was there an English Comstock? The second half of the 19th century was in many ways a thrilling period for English and European culture. Dickens, Eliot, and Hardy celebrated and castigated their own times. Wagner, Verdi, Brahms, and Strauss entertained larger and larger audiences with their ingenious works. And the great minds of the modern sciences like Darwin and Mendel were shocking the world with their observations about life on Earth. By the 1870s, photography, the telegraph, the telephone, along with other amazing inventions and innovations, reflected an increasingly technological world. But while great minds explored the new and the far reaching, the old struggles over right and wrong, moral versus immoral, and the human spirit versus law and order continued to vie for prominence, especially in the legal and political realms. Under the guise of preventing vice from poisoning European society, but more likely with a view to peeking behind closed doors, specifically bedroom doors. Beginning in the 1850s, legislators throughout Europe were passing laws directed toward legislating sex. These ranged from outright bans on the sale of birth control devices to the more Comstockian style statutes intended to prevent innocent citizens from being irrevocably harmed through exposure to smut. Like Americans, Europeans tended to work around the laws. And easier task for them, though, since there were no senior, Monsignor, or Herr Comstocks to contend with. But some of the attempts to protect citizens from themselves, specifically those in Britain, did make life a little uncomfortable for the humble little condom. In 1857, England's Lord Chief Justice Campbell introduced into the House of Lords the Obscene Publications Act, a bill the Chief Justice declared would stop the sale of the kind of written material that led to the corruption of the morals of innocent children, women, and the weak of mind, or, as Campbell declared dramatically, an act of law that would prevent the sale of poison more deadly than prussic acid, strychnine, or arsenic. He also benignly assured his fellow members of Parliament that his bill would not impede real literary pursuits. The first official to enforce the English anti-obscenity law was a royal magistrate by the name of Hicklin. Being the first, Magistrate Hicklin had no precedents to follow, which allowed him to interpret the act according to his own conservative agenda. Although the law was intended to prevent sales or exchanges of pornographic materials, it had also been designed to protect the civil rights of Englishmen, shielding citizens from illegal search and seizure. Specifically, it stated that without a search warrant, no member of the constabulary could simply enter private property to look for obscene literature. Hicklin, however, chose to interpret this to mean that a search warrant could be issued on sworn information given by anyone who stated that an individual possessed pornographic publications intended for sale or distribution. His interpretation put the accused in the position of having to show cause as to why the authorities should not destroy the offending literature and not arrest him. According to Hicklin, then, the burden of proof fell to the owner of obscene material, not the person making the charge. Some British historians believe the Hicklin Act, as it came to be called, was the inspiration for the Comstock Act. Like the Comstock Act's effect on America's sex life, instead of the Hicklin Act keeping innocents free from smut, it did help drive Britain's sex trade underground, where it thrived throughout the last quarter of the 19th century. It did not, however, empower any one government agency or individual to persecute and prosecute in the way the Comstock Act had, leaving it up to the individual police departments to enforce. Rather than Hicklin inspiring the Comstock Act, it was probably the Comstock Act that influenced a later English anti-obscenity law passed by the House of Lords in 1889, which certainly brought the British condom under official scrutiny. The Indecent Act. The Indecent Advertisements Act was one legislator's response to the tremendous number of ads popping up in British newspapers that touted an endless variety of cures for venereal disease. As in the United States, by the 1880s, the pox was back in a big way in the UK. On the street, from storefronts and through print advertising, quacks and charlatans hawked bogus cures to desperate victims. The sponsor of the Indecency Act, the Earl of Meath, was a Christian philanthropist who, to his credit, had done a great deal of public good for London's poor. He supported organizations that advocated for the education of working-class boys, introduced physical education into the English school curriculum, and was a tireless advocate for setting aside green space for public parks. But for reasons known only to himself, Meath had an absolute horror of syphilis, believing any discussion, private or public, about its prevention or cure was obscene. No wonder he was so offended by the advertisements for curatives and preventatives plastered all over the city's cheap newspapers and broadsides. Meath wanted all of it banned as detrimental to common decency. The Advertisements Act, though vaguely worded, was intended to enable the judiciary to take legal action against persons who advertise their specifics against a certain class of diseases of an nameless character. and pointedly included the filthy advertisement of condoms. Instead of separating disease prevention from the cures offered by shysters taking advantage of desperate syphilitics, the Act lumped cures and preventatives together, proving not only a misplaced prudery that had increasingly become the norm among late century upper crust Victorians, but that actually ended up promoting sexual ignorance. Even the royal family did not go unscathed by the growing cloak of sexual silence and its regrettable results. Unwilling to acknowledge the fact that her son had syphilis and help him seek proper treatment, Queen Victoria preferred to pretend it simply did not exist. As far as she and other family members were concerned, Victoria's son, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, had contracted a mysterious malady. The Duke's son, Prince Alfred II, was also a victim of syphilis, but this time, to avoid further scandal, the lesser prince was exiled to Romania, where he died suffering from the dementia common to victims who went untreated. If only those royals had known about and used condoms. The Indecent Advertisements Act certainly reflects the narrow minded, dangerously naive mindset of some late century Englishmen. But in spite of the similarities between the English legislation and the Comstock Act, there were huge differences between the English and the American laws. The English laws were not utilized to prevent the sale of condoms, just their advertisement, and that they were not successful. A kind of out of sight, out of mind approach by moralists who despised the condom as a physical representation of indecent behaviors. No one went to jail for making, selling, or using them. A portrait of the Queen. Queen Victoria may have been unwilling to admit to her family's problems with the clap, but that did not prevent her visage from being used by makers of the little device that might have saved her sons and grandsons' lives. By the time of Queen Victoria's 1897 Diamond Jubilee, droll manufacturers produced very artistic condoms. They had the Queen's portrait printed on them. For the more politically minded, there were also nicely made French letters with English Prime Minister Gladstone's image stamped upon them. These patriotic condoms were proudly sold in small gift shops along London's Petticoat Lane. The market side of protection, coyly referring to a quick trip to the chemist's for a supply of condoms. The expression, a little something for the weekend, was an English phrase that was coined at the time, and another example of the condom's lyrical influence on linguistics and its common usage, just as they had been doing for hundreds of years. Lots of small-time makers working out of back rooms, butcher shops, and small storefronts continue to produce a wide variety and widely differing qualities of condoms through to the end of the 19th century. England's first major public condom manufacturer, E. Lambert and son of Dalston, opened in the 1870s. Although Lambert's was the largest English manufacturer, the production of condoms was not limited to one company. There were a surprising number of brick and mortar businesses establishing in and around London and other major cities, and many of them did a very brisk business selling a wide variety of little somethings for the weekend, as demonstrated by this somewhat remarkable exchange. W. George was informed by the local council that he had to relocate his contraception business because of an 1897 Urban Renewal Act demanding areas of London's Strand be redeveloped. His business, which he had opened in the early 1870s, was relocated on the busy Holywell Street in London, but W. George objected to the gross undervaluing of his business when it came time for the council to reimburse him for the loss of his property. By his estimation, his condom business was worth many thousands of pounds per annum. Adjusting for inflation, that would be in the millions today. But the government board valuer placed the business's worth incorrectly at only £500. Undaunted, W. George pursued his case and hired a lawyer. As the representatives from both sides sat opposite one another in the council chambers, it leaves the reader wondering which of the two men was more embarrassed by the exchange. The law required that anyone objecting to a government evaluation of his business or property be allowed to mount a challenge of the proposed amount offered at a formal hearing. As W. George's hearing began, and already knowing the answer to the question, the council's mutton-chopped solicitor began the formal questioning by asking W. George's legal representative, "Just what is the business done at this shop?" The lawyer answered vaguely that general medical appliances were sold there. Almost whispering, the council solicitor asked, "Anything else?" After some hemming and hawing, W. George's rep replied that the claimant sold American instruments, French letters, Spanish, and other letters. The answer seemed to help the council solicitor find his voice. He asked just who shopped at W. George's, to which the representative answered, "I think we are all gentlemen here. We all know about that. It is not a secret. They are almost a necessity nowadays. Someone must sell them. I may say that judges and clergymen, I know it for a fact, do use letters. This class of business has to be carried on somewhere. Yes, all respectable chemists sell them." Not only does the unique exchange continue to illumine the use of condoms, but proves that they continue to acquire creative euphemisms as the years passed, and as there is no mention of Teutonic letters, Englishmen apparently did not realize that by the end of the century, many of their letters were actually imported from Germany, by then the number one supplier of rubbers for most of Europe. However, it also illustrates the continued hypocrisy surrounding condom use. When W. George took his case to a court of law, he tried in vain to force the council to understand how much his condom business netted. During the arguments, the government solicitor pompously urged the jury to find that the business should be valued on a very different basis from a thoroughly respectable one. The high bailiff was a little fairer, as he begrudgingly told the jury that they were to compensate the owner fairly for the loss of his business, however unpleasant might be its character. In the end, the government recompensed W. George for less than 20% of his year of lost condom sales. There was no word on where the judges and clergymen would now purchase their American instruments. Though disappointed about the loss of income, W. George, his real name was W. R. Harrison, did continue to do a thriving business through his mail order catalog, where other suppliers as well as individuals could purchase American tips, skin letters, available in two sizes, small and ordinary, and rubber letters, the best, surest, and most frequently used of any known appliance. He was in competition with barbers, chemists, surgical supply stores, pubs, and even tobacconists, as well as other mail order businesses, but his was one of the best and highest quality inventories in the business. Perhaps one of the most innovative mail order advertising campaigns in history appeared at this time. It was for rubber goods for new parents, appealing to couples who had just had babies. The rubber entrepreneurs checked birth announcements in local and national papers, then sent each couple a flyer explaining the benefits of their particular condoms, which were foolproof birth control. The upshot of the ads was to appeal to new parents who not only missed having sex, but did not want to risk having another little darling. It was a very successful campaign. The English had their anti-condom critics, but no Englishman ever went so far as to try to legislate or prosecute in the American manner. The acts of the last half of the 19th century never produced a fanatic like Anthony Comstock, and legal actions against individuals were reserved mostly for high visibility proponents of sex and disease education, free love, and those who sought to bring homosexuality out of the closet. The English birth control movement did meet with legal battles and legal resistance throughout the latter half of the 19th century. Its proponents and their leaders faced jail time if they were caught publishing and distributing literature written to educate about or promote birth control. But not unlike Americans, the English, especially the middle class, purchased their condoms in ever increasing numbers. The difference was that English law never made the selling or use of birth control devices illegal. Ooh la la. Elsewhere in Europe, the condom did not come under the same kind of scrutiny as in the United States and England. In 1868, a French doctor publicly denounced condom use, equating it with masturbation, and generally condemned sex with coit avec le condom. But he was probably not in the majority. Historically speaking, the French had in many ways been the most open about condom use. True or not, they had long been credited with inventing the word rouge, and it is the French who continued the tradition of manufacturing with a great deal of imagination and no little humor, an entertaining variety of letters. In fact, the most famous 19th century rouge was created by the French and is still around today. The French Tickler began life as a serious rubber condom, but with a little something extra for the ladies. The glass molds used for making ticklers were blown with little protuberances all around the outer wall, so that the finished rubber product came out with lots of fingers for extra stimulation. The design was an attempt to get around the 50-year-old complaint that rubbers were not comfortable, especially for women. But the clever French producers did not stop with the French tickler. By the 1890s, throughout Paris and other major city centers, a condom consumer could purchase any number of specialty brochuses that put the English Prime Minister's portrait to shame. These included Le Porc Épic, the porcupine, l'inusable, l'inusable, hard-wearing, le conquérant, the conqueror, le cocorico, the caca-doodle-doo, le santé nitrouché, the she looks as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, and le bébé chatrouilleur, the baby tickler. Definitely more interesting than sporting a portrait of Queen Victoria, and modern condoms really are humble in comparison. No Teutonic ticklers. Although the rest of Europe did not put the portraits of its royals or political leaders on condoms like the English, or show the astounding inventiveness of the French, they did continue to use them. In late century Germany, selling contraceptive devices was technically illegal, but because of lax legal enforcement, the strong desire to limit family size, and the German military's encouragement of disease prevention through condom use, which served to educate a lot of young men about its hows and whys. Germans knew about and used condoms extensively. They were also exposed to ads in their major newspapers, where advertisers employed obvious euphemisms like rubber articles. And perhaps not surprisingly, German engineering was at its best when it came to condom production. Rubber producers made their rubber skins from the most advanced manufacturing methods available, and by the turn of the century, German rubbers were the highest quality and most popular in all of Europe. In fact, the Germans were not only supplying most European nations, they were also exporting to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The Italians, on the other hand, were more inscrutable when it came to their use of condoms. Few population records were kept until 1861, when the Italian states unified as one nation. They also left very few personal records to help document just how large a role condom use played in fertility limitation. This is in part because of the tumultuous political upheaval of the second half of the 19th century, and because of the influence of the Vatican. But mostly German produced condoms were available from barbers and chemists in the major cities of Italy, and there are sufficient records available to make it clear that between 1800 and 1900, Italy had experienced a significant and intentional drop in fertility, and the condom played a role in that population decline. It was helpful, too, that though the sale of birth control devices was illegal in 19th century Italy, condoms were sold as disease preventatives. Common knowledge of their other use, of course, was just that. Unlike Americans and other Europeans, Italians had a long memory. They had, after all, invented the little device. By the end of the century, the Dutch, along with the Swiss, Danes, and Swedes, bought German condoms and had their own small manufacturers of skins and rubbers. All were avid users of condoms. In Holland, the first leader of the birth control movement there was also the first woman to graduate from a Dutch university and Holland's first woman doctor. Aletta Jacobs learned about contraception from the Germans and is credited with developing the first diaphragm. And is credited with developing the first diaphragm. She also approved of and recommended condoms, preferably made from silk. Whether or not these were widely available is unknown, but it is yet more evidence of the wide variety on the European market at the time, with the new rubbers vying with more traditional fabrics and guts that had been popular for many centuries in many cultures. One of the few places in Europe that remained stubbornly anti-condom was Ireland. Although the Irish had suffered their first outbreak of the English pox in 1496, the condom had never been manufactured or sold, at least not legally, as disease prevention in that country. Not until the 1970s did the condom leave behind its sad history as foul contraband to quietly take its legal place as a birth control device. Chapter 10. The 19th century's greatest invention. Muckrakers, moral armor, and the Great War. As the 19th century came to a close, American Express had introduced traveler's checks. The term spaceship had come into use, and IBM was born. As the tabulating machine company, H.G. Wells added to the new outer space genre with his Martians and the War of the Worlds, and Conan Doyle introduced the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Suffragists on both sides of the pond were moving forward with their demands for the vote, some becoming martyrs to the cause. Telephones were all the rage, and by 1891, Londoners could ring their friends in Paris. Meanwhile, secretaries were tapping away on their 450,000 typewriters. On the flip side, the negative effects of urbanization, immigration, and industrialization were being exposed by muckrakers like Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair, who began a campaign to bring light to the horrible conditions many immigrants and child laborers in the United States endured. The British, meanwhile, were busy trying to keep their empire together. But for all the changes taking place during this period, some things remained constant. Condoms were still the Western world's favorite birth control method. Sex in America. In a surprisingly candid lifestyle survey done in the 1890s by Celia Mauchin, a woman doctor practicing in New York City, middle class American women appear to have been very honest about their sex lives. Mauchin found that the majority of women she canvassed reported a healthy enjoyment of sex, and that even those born before 1850 had consistently used birth control throughout their married lives. And many of them spoke specifically of using and even liking condoms. A decade later, another woman doctor conducted a similar survey, and she found that by 1900, the statistics remained the same, and that 45% of her respondents used and appreciated condoms. But overall, the condom dichotomy remained the same through to the end of the century. On one hand, the Comstock Act would not be overturned until after World War One, so the condom had to remain in the closet legally. On the other hand, the law was in direct conflict with the desire on the parts of so many to be in control of their own sexual destinies. And where there was money to be made, there were also people willing to take their chances by flaunting the law and producing for a hungry market an ever increasing variety of skins, capotes, and rubber goods. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt, America's first progressive president, took office, and his presidency ushered in a time when vital public agencies were created to protect the health and well being of Americans. Under the progressive umbrella, the followers of people like Margaret Sanger pursued their goals of sexual, political, and social equality. However, as with the 19th, the reformers of the 20th century did not make the direct connection between the condom and health, in spite of the soaring VD rate. Instead, there was an interesting mixture of prudish, moralistic calls for abstinence and for education about sexually transmitted diseases, but nothing was said about practical prevention. As the 19th century ended, the use of rubbers continued to increase, but as birth control. Unlike the earlier history of the condom, even aristocrats like Casanova were very careful to use protection to save the fair sex from anxiety. It was not a notion that had stood the test of time, at least not in 19th and early 20th century America. As the venereal disease rate climbed throughout the 19th century, the medical community and the moral watchdogs increasingly perceived sexually transmitted diseases as punishment for the sins of the sexually obsessed, leaving it to individual Americans to rediscover the condom as a disease preventative. Moral prophylaxis. There should be taught such disgust and dread of these conditions that naught would be induce the seeking of a polluted source for the sake of gratifying a controllable desire. Into the first decades of the 20th century, the prejudice against victims of venereal disease was so great that even large, well equipped hospitals like Boston's Massachusetts General excluded all syphilitics. The same was true of hospitals throughout the country. For years, the American medical community simply sat on the fence, rarely speaking out about education and prevention. Yet, for all the fear and prejudice, and in spite of the lingering effects of the Comstock Act, America's sex trade was burgeoning. In 1900, Manhattan alone had at least 15,000 prostitutes plying their trade in the streets, working in brothels, back rooms of saloons, and even turning tricks in cafes. But this was a new age for reformers, and a significant number of those who wanted to end the sex trade once and for all approached the problem quite differently from their 19th century counterparts. For the first time, some reformers pointed out that men, not women, drove the trade, profiting by exploiting women as their pimps and patrons. The reformers also recognized the relationship between the increase in prostitution and that of venereal disease, and they began the fire to bring the problem out of the closet and into the national spotlight. Some state legislators also got involved with the struggle against the spread of venereal disease by passing laws requiring physicians to report VD cases to the public health authorities. This, however, represented a dilemma for doctors who rarely complied with the rules because they feared that it would lead to victims hiding their affliction. One physician was quoted as saying, "The treatment of venereal diseases has too long been left in the hands of charlatans and leeches who suck out the gold while they frighten their victims into silence." Another was more direct. "If physicians are required to report these patients by name, they will, in short time, if they are honest, have no patients to report." In spite of the sporadic political attempts to deal with venereal outbreaks, as the Progressive Era matured, it was the social hygienists, and so called because they were determined to sanitize American sexual behaviors, who began the campaign to end public ignorance and misunderstanding about venereal diseases. This group was made up of reform-minded activists and medical experts, and was the first organization in American history to recognize that the only way to end VD was to go public about its prevention. The hygienists also made public something about VD that had been recognized only recently. Science had proven that those who contracted syphilis were not the only victims. Many innocent wives and children suffered the long-term effects of disease because women could be infected by their husbands and then give birth to children who suffered from the birth defects and early deaths common to babies born of syphilitics. The American Society for Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis put it like this: "Now the role of muckraker is considered neither dignified nor desirable. The work of delving in the filth of human weakness and depravity is unsavory, even repulsive. It can be undertaken only from a sense of duty, but the muck is there and needs to be racked. The public should know that the introduction of venereal infection into marriage constitutes its chief social danger, and at the same time makes up the saddest chapter in the martyrdom of women." History, though, had proved time and again that prevention was not achieved just through pious declarations, and the hygienists' alas, were not interested in the condom. I have spared no pains to make known that my plays are built to induce not voluptuous reverie, but intellectual interest, not romantic rhapsody, but humane concern. George Bernard Shaw. Shaw's illuminated gangrene. Letters were so popular in late 19th century England that literary giant George Bernard Shaw boldly and incorrectly stated that the condom was the 19th century's greatest invention. Shaw apparently had no idea of the history of the condom, but his exposure to England's pro condom birth controllers had convinced him of their importance. Unlike the American social hygienist movement, England's version did have its condom adherents, and they had a strange bedfellow in the famous, and often infamous, Irish playwright. Shaw was very active in a number of the reform movements taking place in England in the late 19th century, marching hand in hand with birth control advocates like Betsy Besant and Mary Stopes, as well as militant Irish freedom fighters. But Shaw's greatest contribution to the promotion of condom use and to women's rights was his play Mrs. Warren's Profession. In this terribly controversial work, Shaw tried to enlighten English and American audiences about the social reasons for prostitution and why women were often forced into the profession. He wrote Mrs. Warren to help both societies understand that prostitutes were not licentious sinners deserving to contract syphilis, as so many Victorians and social hygienists believed. Rather, he strove to convince the public that prostitution and the resulting spread of venereal disease was a product of the oppression of women, a belief he shared in common with some social reformers. Ultimately, he hoped to see an end to the trade, but in the meantime, to at least educate women about safe sex. He also hoped to convince men to take the initiative and use sheath, but Mrs. Warren's profession was slammed by American critics as it had been by British as gross sensation, wholly immoral and degenerate, and illuminated gangrene. In 1905, it played only one night in a New York theater, after which Anthony Comstock himself had the entire cast arrested for indecency. Strangely, although Mrs. Warren was panned by critics and Comstock, it was resurrected later and actually performed in Washington, D.C. for President Woodrow Wilson, America's third progressive president, his cabinet members, and chosen congressmen with the intention of educating them about how and why women became prostitutes. Judging by what happened during World War One, Shaw's message was lost on this group of gentlemen. The notion that Mrs. Warren must be a fiend is only an example of the violence and passion which the slightest reference to sex arouses in undisciplined minds, and which makes it seem natural for our lawgivers to punish silly and negligible indecencies with a ferocity unknown in dealing with, for example, ruinous financial swindling. Had my play been titled Mrs. Warren's Profession and Mr. Warren been a bookmaker, nobody would have expected me to make him a villain as well. had my play been titled Mr. Warren's Profession. That's Shaw's response to his critics. With the lights turned out, sex education in progressive America. In spite of the efforts of some of the moral enlightened hygienists, this era was an odd mix of progressivism and leftover Victorian morals. Though it is during this time that sex education, a new concept in public schooling, was born, the intention was to help clean up American sexual mores, not to help the young understand themselves and their own sexuality. Courses and curriculum development were plagued with conflict within the movement itself over just how, when, and by whom the message of prevention should be delivered. The arguments, like those specifically around venereal disease prevention, began more than 100 years ago, and they are still being debated today. There were those who believed sex education belonged at home, which meant little more than remaining status quo and at risk. Others believed only specially trained teachers. One of the positive outcomes of the progressive movement was the development of specialized, university based training for educators. Should be allowed to teach such a delicate and important subject. It was not, however, necessarily a very open minded curriculum. Columbia University Teachers College, one of America's premier colleges for teachers, then as now required teachers in training to attend classes in sexual hygiene. One teacher preparation manual explained that it was vital for new teachers to understand that students' daydreaming about sex was even worse than masturbation. Daydreaming could go on and on. Not so with masturbation. Other programs insisted that teachers know about and preach that abstinence was the only acceptable behavior, except when sex was necessary for procreation. Human nature did not influence the curriculum. Oddly, in spite of the stilted and puritanical language used by the progressives and medical experts in the first few decades of the 20th century, with all the arguments and leftover prudery, the hygienists' conversations and debates did serve to bring VD education out into the open, and that was a step in the right direction. This fact, along with the demise of the Comstock Act in 1918, began to pave the way to making the condom at long last legitimate. But it took a world war, not the progressive movement, to really bring the condom out into the light and back to its necessary role as a disease preventative. FDR and Blackjack. In 1916, while commanding troops along the unstable Mexican American border, General Blackjack Pershing had the same concerns about his army that had supposedly led King Charles II of England to provide condoms to his men. VD was a huge problem among American soldiers, and Pershing did not want his ranks to be decimated by the contagion. Black Jack proved to be a forward thinking leader when he took it upon himself to try to prevent the growing problem of his soldiers contacting VD while visiting the many brothels that popped up wherever the men were stationed. He devised a system of army controlled clean brothels where condoms were provided when available and the women were regulated by army physicians. His efforts were rewarded with a decreased rate of VD and still happy soldiers. And Pershing was was a politician first. He understood the sexually confused climate he was working in. He did not advertise his success. Meanwhile, there were a number of doctors in the American Navy who had served on German ships in the first years of the 20th century, and they had witnessed the trials and successes of the German Navy's anti-VD program. The strategy was one of prevention, freely distributed preservatives, early detection, a German innovation, post-exposure chemical treatment. The French pioneered the anti-syphilis drug Salvarsan, but its first successful testing was done in England at the Rochester Row Military Hospital in 1911. It was the Germans, however, who adopted its use for all of their military, making it, in a sense, a German medical breakthrough. No German sailor went aboard ship without his kit, and this remained true until World War II. The American naval physicians admired the Germans' practical, straightforward approach and took it upon themselves to put together anti-VD packets, which were provided to American sailors serving on ships in Asia. American Army officials who saw the kits got into the act. In 1910, groups of soldiers were given supplies for VD prevention. This was actually a test to determine whether or not soldiers would even bother to use preventatives and if their use would impact the VD rate among the chosen groups of soldiers. This experiment was a huge success. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt got very excited when he heard about the sailors' kits. FDR immediately ordered that all American sailors serving on ships overseas be supplied with what became known as prophylaxis kits. Although the word prophylaxis was intended to describe the entire process of prevention and cure, FDR's reference coined the latest euphemism for the condom. Prophylaxis was soon shortened to PRO, which stuck through to the end of World War II. History repeats itself, the fundamental condom. The economically and politically powerful members of the social hygiene movement were furious when they found out about FDR's move, and they vetoed any future plans to supply members of the military with pros. These moral scions claimed that providing condoms to sailors and soldiers was like giving them a green light to behave promiscuously. After all, bad behavior should be punished, not aided and abetted. The anti-prophylaxis hygienists had a powerful ally in Josephus Daniels. Woodrow Wilson's new Secretary of the Navy, appointed just before America's entry into World War I, had been away on business the day his assistant, FDR, had ordered the naval prophylaxis kits. A fundamentalist Christian, Daniels believed VD was divine punishment for the sin of having sex for any purpose other than reproduction. It turned out that even before FDR got involved, quite a few commanders, aware of the Asian experiment and tired of losing valuable time and labor to disease, had also been putting together their own kits and selling them on board their ships. They knew what VD did to the ranks, and also knew preaching abstinence was a waste of breath. Daniel's first act as Secretary of the Navy was to demand that the commanders stop selling these devices to sailors and to put an end to Roosevelt's prophylaxis provisions. It is wicked to encourage and approve placing in the hands of the men an appliance which will lead them to think that they may indulge in practices which are not sanctioned by moral, military, or civil law, with impunity, and the use of which would tend to subvert and destroy the very foundations of our moral and Christian beliefs and teachings in regard to these sexual matters. It was in this muddled atmosphere that the United States made its late entry into Europe's Great War. Slackers, sluts, and syphilis. The United States became involved in World War I in 1917, 3 years after it had begun, when Woodrow Wilson committed to sending troops to France. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau generously informed Wilson's Secretary of War that the American expeditionary forces would have access to the French army's regulated brothels, where soldiers could visit clean prostitutes. Uh, the United States became involved in World War I in 1917, 3 years after it had begun, when Woodrow Wilson committed to sending troops to France. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau generously informed Wilson's Secretary of War that the American expeditionary forces would have access to French's army's regulated brothels, where soldiers could visit clean prostitutes. This had been standard practice for the French military since Napoleon, and what better way to control the spread of syphilis among troops? The American secretary's response to the translated message was, "Oh my God, don't tell the president out or he'll pull out of this war before we send the first troops." Mystified by the negative response to his generous offer and concerned about the ramifications of the American insistence that the French brothels be off limits to the doughboys. The greatest concern was that the Americans would go to clandestines, unregulated prostitutes, spreading syphilis as they went. As American troops began to arrive in France, Clemenceau had an inspector from the French Surgeon General's office do an official study of the French military brothels. What the inspector concluded was that the American policies were prudish and repressive, ignoring the realities of the male libido. Allowed or not, as soon as they got off the boats, American soldiers were making a beeline for the brothels. Interestingly, the inspector also revealed what had been intentionally hidden by the American military. American soldiers were bringing syphilis with them to France and infecting the French prostitutes they were not supposed to be consorting with. In his final report, the French inspector concluded that, beginning with the principle that chastity is possible, they have declared an official continence and they confide to religion and morals the duty of maintaining morality in man and keeping him always master of his passions. They depend, however, on violent exercise to afford distraction and to diminish the desire for their soldiers. As the French inspector had found out, violent exercise did not work. Invisible prophylaxis. Despite Wilson's explicit and sexually charged letters to both of his wives, publicly he was a very pious and prim man, as illustrated by the Secretary of the Navy's attitudes. Wilson selected a staff that mirrored his own beliefs, and the American military was dominated by like minded prudes. Secretary of War Newton Baker's words encapsulate the group's approach to protecting the American military from disease. These boys are going to France, and they are going to face conditions we do not like to talk about, that we do not like to think about. I want them armed. I want them adequately armed and clothed by their government, but I want them to have invisible armor to take with them. I want them to have an armor made up of a set of social habits, replacing those of their homes and communities, moral and intellectual armor for their protection overseas. The French premier could have told him that this was not the armor the doughboys really needed, though there were many military surgeons and commanders who felt it was foolish and short-sighted not to supply real prophylaxis to their men. Voices of reason were not heeded. Instead, sailors and soldiers were taught that the best way to prevent infection from venereal diseases was through abstinence. Drill sergeants and officers were ordered to provide soldiers with invisible armor rather than the practical sort. In lecturing the new recruits about abstinence, their leaders told them this about their penises: forget them, don't think about them, or dwell upon them. Live a good and vigorous life, and they will take care of themselves. Only slackers consort with sluts, which leads to syphilis. And live straight so you can shoot straight was the only help the American army was given. Not surprisingly, it did not work. Although the military, specifically the army, would not admit it, 70% of those soldiers infected with syphilis had actually gotten it stateside from American prostitutes working at the many brothels just outside of the army posts where the new recruits were trained. Instead of facing this fact and fixing the problem, army officials blamed French prostitutes and warned the doughboys of the dangers and of dalliances with French women. That, like all the other efforts to prevent men from getting the clap, failed. America's great army was the only force in Europe not supplied with condoms as a standard part of their kit. Individual government officials, as well as organizations like the American Social Hygiene Association, fought tooth and nail to keep the condom out of the hands and off the penises of our boys in the military, and continued to cite such convincing arguments as: if you risked getting a venereal disease and caught one, then you deserved it. Not very progressive. But all the pompous talk at home did not stop some American military men from procuring condoms from vendors, selling them in and near the American R&R stations, as well as from the prostitutes who were routinely supplied by French officials, from barbers in the cities and towns, and from other Allied soldiers, all of whom had access to a free and ready supply of American made rubbers, sheaths, and French letters. Were the Allies clean? Venereal disease and its prevention have never taken center stage in any Western history, but in those brief mentions of the VD problems of World War One, historians generally state that the English and French were well prepared with protection, full stop. However, this is in fact far too simplistic, especially in regard to the English, who also suffered from the remnants of the prudish and hypocritical Victorian era. First, as mentioned in previous chapters, there was never a limit on prohibition on the sales and marketing of condoms in the UK. But like the rest of the Western world, what was practiced in one arena was not always so in another. As late as 1914, the British military was still being subjected to the old sexual purity literature, where men were told that they should practice cleanliness, moderation, pure air, and self control, avoiding impure conversation, thought, and temptation. Lord Kitchener himself appealed to the British Expeditionary Force to keep constantly on your guard against any excesses. In this new experience, you may find temptations both in wine and women. You must entirely resist both temptations, and while treating women with perfect courtesy, you should avoid any intimacy. This was not an isolated prudishness from the old days. His words are very much a reflection of how many military leaders approached the subject of sex and the soldier. But there was more than one school of thought on just how to keep the British military free of disease when their men were not stuck in the foxholes at the front. Some officers tried to occupy them with sports and recreation. This, in conjunction with extreme stigma, if caught, was thought to be a good way to discourage licentious behaviors. The stigma part of the philosophy included public censure of a sort. In the first few years of war, any British military member found to have a venereal disease at a clinic or at a dangle parade, those hated and embarrassing spot inspections of the private parts, was punished by having his family members notified of his illness. This draconian approach was ended in 1916 when an officer committed suicide after finding out his wife had been informed. After that, the family was simply told their loved ones had been hospitalized, perhaps not a great improvement. The treatments themselves may also have been enough of a punishment since they could be painful and some had severe side effects, but even that did not deter individual soldiers from actually trying to get a case of the clap. Anything not to return to the trenches. Some leaders believed in and tried the French model, which was to regulate prostitution, sanctioning only certain brothels in order to control disease. That did not work either. Though too late for some, what did work well was a practical and scientific approach, one that did not rely on philosophy or self restraint or waste medical personnel's time and energy, and intelligent rather than moralistic prophylaxis. Easy and unfettered access was the cheapest, safest, and most humane approach, and the one that finally won out before the end of the Great War. The English military eventually took its lead from one of the colonies. Sexually speaking, the New Zealanders were the best equipped of any, with supplies of more condoms and postcoital treatment than their soldiers or sailors could possibly ever use. Australians were also routinely supplied with blue like kits, as were the Canadians. Although British soldiers continued to contract VD, something some historians believe was very much a class driven phenomena. The numbers dropped tremendously when their military leaders routinely supplied their troops with rubbers. These even came in a variety of sizes small, medium, or large, and colors rose, drab, or ivory, with or without a teat and axis prophylaxis. The Allies were not the only ones familiar with condom use for disease prevention. The Axis military was provided with state of the art German made condoms throughout the war. Just as before the war, every German sailor and soldier had his own generous supply of preservatives. The Australian military ran official brothels, and leaders were very cautious about making sure their facilities had official signs clearly posted with the rules of how and what the soldiers were to do when they used the services of the government supplied prostitutes. These included directives for both the soldiers and the women and were printed in German, Hungarian, and Croatian. The posts also made it clear that the girls were expected to reject diseased guests, as well as make sure every man used a condom. The girls should demand of the guest that he use preventative instrument. The brothels did not provide them for free, but each sign included a statement about cost. Preservatives are available at the price of, and the last line on the sign was one of advice. The best known protection against infection is the use of condom, which is to be drawn carefully over the member and then sufficiently lubricated with chlorinated Vaseline. Businesslike, but very effective. Love 'em or hate 'em. The VD rate among American soldiers was very high. Military doctors and commanders found that shortly after entering the war, orders or not, there were so many men already infected or at risk. They had to provide some kind of a protection. This led to prophylactic stations where soldiers could go for treatment if they felt they might be at risk. But these were postcoital chemical treatments. In addition, the stations were difficult to provide, staff, and maintain, which led some commanders to quietly find ways to provide condoms to their men whenever possible. Those commanders included Blackjack Pershing, who publicly denounced the condom but privately recognized the need. The narrow minded, hypocritical approach to venereal disease protection and prevention, and lack thereof, took a terrible toll on the American fighting force. It led to a historically high incidence of syphilis and gonorrhea, almost 400,000 cases by the end of the war, which impacted military readiness, morale, and cost the American government a fortune in medical treatment. It was a tragedy that taught military leaders and politicians a painful lesson. And at least in this case, history would not repeat itself. War commerce. Condom magnate Julius Schmidt's business was going strong in the 1910s. Ever the consummate businessman, as the winds of war began to blow, the native German recognized that the primary producer of European rubbers, Germany, would no longer be able to sell to other European nations. Schmidt also knew of the European, Australian, and New Zealander militaries' policies on providing prophylaxis to their men. With this in mind, Schmidt geared up to supply the European allies with condoms. It was a brilliant business strategy. Schmidt's overseas sales boomed during the war, especially those to England, where by the end of the 19th century, German rubbers had dominated the market but were no longer available because of the war. Schmidt was not alone in seeing wartime as a chance to expand his condom production and sales. Merrill Youngs, founder of Younger's Rubber Company, saw a golden opportunity to pick up where the beleaguered English rubber industry had left off. And it was at this time that the most advanced and most famous condom was born. The first Trojans were produced in 1916. But it was not just the foreign market Schmidt was interested in. He was convinced that if Ramses, Sheiks, and Trojans teamed up, Schmidt and Youngs could find a legitimate way to sell condoms to to the American military, something Schmidt felt would be too tall in order for just one manufacturer. An agreement that sales would skyrocket and both companies would make a fortune. The men directed their lawyer to send a letter to the U.S. Secretary General, making sure not to mention the two of them by name or to identify the names of their companies. The lawyer inquired as to whether the secretary actually recommended or was planning to recommend this kind of disease preventing prophylaxis to his military physicians. Interestingly, the letter was worded in such a way as to actually determine whether or not the official considered it legal to produce condoms or condoms, a misspelling that may or may not have been a typo in the letter. This backdoor approach to condom marketing was just a few years ahead of its time, and although their request was denied in not very friendly language, the two condom producers still benefited from the fortunes of war. Comstockery's last gasp. Not long before the end of World War One, the 1918 Crane Act finally ended the legal ban on condom sales and production in the United States. Oddly, it was Margaret Sanger who inadvertently opened up the door to the legalization of condoms when she provided them at her short lived birth control clinic in New York. She was arrested for her efforts and the case went to court. The first judge dismissed Sanger's claim that women not only had the right to use birth control, but it also was a social obligation, helping to alleviate poverty, overcrowding, and lessening the need for abortions. To mention a few of the reasons she gave, the judge, on the other hand, believed that women had no right to that sort of regulation, and that sex was only for reproduction. But that did not stop Singer. The second time the case went to court, the tide had finally turned, and the abuses of the Comstock Act were ended at long last. Influenced by the fact that American politicians and the medical profession had been forced to take the venereal disease epidemic, military and civilian, seriously, going so far as to create a division within the U.S. Public Health Services, the Division of Venereal Diseases, and committing millions of dollars to eradicate the scourge. Judge Frederick Crane of the New York Court of Appeals permanently removed the legal limitations of selling, producing, or educating about condom use when he stated that condoms were disease preventatives. He also cited them as health aids because they prevented dangerous pregnancies. Although this was a mix of Although this was a mixed bag for Sanger, since she was not really pro condom as a birth control option, and her area of concern was not really disease prevention, the ruling turned the condom into a legitimate device and opened up the doors to new business opportunities, and it once and for all killed the Comstock Act. Just before the war ended in 1918, American condoms were sold publicly for the first time in 45 years. The Comstock Act, along with Comstock himself, was dead, but it was too late for all those soldiers who had not been able to access practical prophylaxis. And although the British had never tried to ban sales, and wiser heads had helped provide the British military with necessary prophylaxis, throughout the 20s, there would still be those who tried their best to make the condom a dirty little secret.